1947. Somewhere in the forests east of Moscow, a slow train carries a group of scientists toward a destination they have not been allowed to know. They understand only that they have been selected for work of the highest importance. The men who recruited them would not name the place. They would not describe the town. They would not even confirm that a town existed at the far end of the line. The scientists watched the stations grow smaller through the window and then stop having names they recognized. The journey ended at a checkpoint deep in the woods, roughly 370 kilometers from the capital. Soldiers in the green caps of the security services collected every document. Beyond a perimeter of barbed wire and watchtowers rose the onion domes of an old monastery, half hidden among the pines. This was the destination, and the strangest thing about it was that it did not exist. It was absent from every published map of the Soviet Union. It was missing from the census. It had no entry in any telephone directory, no listing in any regional almanac, no dot on any road atlas printed for the public. Letters to the people who lived there were addressed to a post office box in a city far away. Their internal passports recorded a birthplace they had never seen. For the outside world, the men and women behind that fence were simply gone, absorbed into a rumor of secret work somewhere in the vastness of the country. This is the story of that vanished place. It carried a dozen code names across 4 decades. It was called an installation, a base, a combine, a mailbox, with a number attached. The scientists who lived inside its wire gave it a dark, private joke of a nickname, borrowing from the American laboratory they were racing to catch. They called it Los Alzamas. And within its guarded perimeter, on the grounds of one of the holiest sites in Russian Orthodoxy, a generation of the Soviet Union's finest minds designed the weapons that would define the second half of the 20th century. If the hidden architecture of the Cold War fascinates you, the secret programs, the buried cities, the machinery of an entire era built out of sight, then consider subscribing, because we are going to reconstruct this world piece by piece, from the tradecraft to the engineering to the human cost. To understand what this place was, we first have to understand why it had to disappear. The story does not begin with a bomb, it begins with a saint. Long before it made weapons of mass destruction, the settlement of Sarov was a place of pilgrimage. A hermitage was founded there in the early 1700s, deep in the forest where 2 rivers met. Over the next 2 centuries, it grew into one of the most revered monastic communities in the Russian Empire. Its most famous resident was a monk named Prokhor Moshnin, who took the religious name Seraphim and lived for years as a hermit in the surrounding woods. He became known across Russia as Seraphim of Sarov, and in 1903 he was formally recognized as a saint in a ceremony attended by Tsar Nicholas II himself. Pilgrims came by the tens of thousands to pray at his relics. At its height, the monastery held hundreds of monks and a cluster of churches, one of them built underground. There is a strange afterlife to that holiness. In our own era, some in Russia have come to regard Seraphim of Sarov, informally, as a kind of patron saint of the country's nuclear weapons, precisely because the town that bears his name became the place where those weapons were designed. A hermit who sought perfect silence in the forest lent his name, centuries later, to the loudest machines ever built. But that irony lay far in the future. First, the monastery had to be destroyed. The revolution saw to that. The new Soviet state had no use for monasteries. In the 1920s, the community at Sarov was shut down and its monks were driven out. The buildings were stripped of their religious purpose and put to secular work. First, they housed a colony for orphaned and delinquent children. Later, as the country armed for war, the site was turned into a small factory. During the fight against Nazi Germany, the old holy ground produced shell casings and components for rocket artillery. The bells were gone. The prayers were gone. In their place came the rhythm of the machine shop. Sarov might have remained a minor industrial town lost in the forest, except for what happened over 2 Japanese cities in August of 1945. When the United States destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki with atomic bombs, the balance of world power shifted in a single week. Joseph Stalin understood at once what it meant. The Soviet Union had bled more than any nation to defeat Germany, and now its wartime ally possessed a weapon against which there was no defense. Stalin ordered his scientists to build a Soviet bomb, and he ordered it done at any cost, on the shortest possible timeline. He placed the entire effort under the control of the man he trusted to make the impossible happen through sheer force. The head of the secret police, Lavrentiy Beria. The scientific direction of the project fell to a physicist named Igor Kurchatov, a broad-bearded man who would become the central figure of the whole Soviet atomic enterprise. He had run the secret wartime nuclear research effort out of a modest institution in Moscow known only by a deliberately dull cover name, Laboratory No. 2. Colleagues nicknamed him the Beard because he had sworn not to shave until the Soviet bomb was finished, and he wore that beard for the rest of his life. Above him sat a special committee and a powerful new organ of the state created to run the bomb program, a body whose name translated roughly as the First Chief Directorate, answerable to Beria and to Stalin alone. This was total mobilization. The project could command industry, science, and labor across the entire country. And it did. But Kurchatov needed a place to design the actual weapon. Not to mine uranium, not to build reactors, but to do the precise and dangerous work of turning nuclear physics into a device that could be dropped from an aircraft. He needed somewhere remote so that high explosive tests could be carried out in secret. He needed somewhere with existing buildings and an existing workforce so the time would not be lost on construction. And he needed somewhere close enough to Moscow to stay under tight central control. In the spring of 1946, a survey team settled on the old monastery town in the forest. It was isolated. It already had a factory. It sat far from any border and far from prying foreign eyes. On the 9th of April 1946, a secret government resolution created a new design bureau, and a few days later, on the 13th of April, that bureau was formally established at Sarov. Its official name was a deliberate blank. It was called Design Bureau No. 11, or KB11. In the years to come, the physicist Yuri Khariton, who had studied in England under the great Ernest Rutherford before the war, would serve as its scientific director, a post he would hold for nearly half a century. Kurchatov oversaw the whole project from above. Beria supplied the resources, the labor, and the fear. From that moment, Sarov ceased to exist as a public place. The name was struck from maps. The town was sealed. And so began the strange double life of a settlement that would spend the next half-century as one of the most important and most invisible places on Earth. Turning a ruined monastery and a small munitions plant into a working weapons laboratory took years and an army of laborers. New apartment blocks rose among the old church buildings. The monastery's own structures were repurposed, its halls converted into offices and workshops, its grounds swallowed by a secret institute. A whole town of scientists, technicians, guards, and their families grew up behind the fence with schools and clinics and shops, an entire self-contained world sealed off from the country around it. The people who built it and the people who staffed it lived on the same ground, the privileged and the imprisoned, divided by the same wire that hid them all from view. Consider the sheer scale of what the Soviet state was attempting here, and the paradox buried inside it. To build the bomb, the leadership had to gather its most brilliant, most independent-minded people, the theoretical physicists, the mathematicians, the chemists and engineers, the kind of people whose entire training taught them to question, to doubt, and to follow evidence wherever it led. And then it had to lock those people inside a cage. It had to surround free thinkers with barbed wire and informers. It had to demand total creativity and total obedience at the same time from the same people in the same rooms. The whole enterprise rested on a contradiction. It needed genius, and genius does not thrive under a boot. Yet somehow, under enormous pressure, it worked. The naming of the place became its own peculiar art form. Over the decades, the town cycled through more cover identities than almost any settlement in Soviet history. It was base number 112, it was site 550. It was called, at various points, by names meant to sound ordinary and forgettable. Eventually it settled into the designation by which the West would come to know it, Arzamas 16. The system behind that name was simple and used across the whole hidden network. You took the name of a real known town some distance away, and you attached a number to it, usually the number of a post office box. The genuine town of Alzheimer's lay some 75 kilometers off. For a while, the censors grew nervous that an early version of the code name might accidentally reveal the true distance, and therefore the true location, so the number was quietly changed. A secret city could be undone by arithmetic. Inside, the scientists developed their own culture, half prison, half elite club. They knew exactly what they were doing and exactly what they could never say. They referred to their home simply as the installation, or the object, as if it were a thing rather than a place. And, with the dark humor of clever people under strain, they called it Los Alzheimer's, a nod to Los Alamos in the New Mexico desert, where their American rivals had built the first bombs. It was a joke, but it was also an admission. Tar. They knew they were the mirror image of the enemy, working the same problem from the other side of the world. The secrecy inside the wire was suffocating and precise. The most senior scientists were assigned bodyguards who followed them everywhere, not only to protect them, but to watch them. Informers moved among the staff. Written reports were handled with extraordinary care because even the typing pool could not be fully trusted with the vocabulary of the work. Certain words were forbidden on paper. The words uranium and plutonium were not to be written plainly. Scientists used code phrases and substitutions, referring to the deadly materials by neutral stand-ins. When the young theoretical physicist Andrei Sakharov arrived at the installation, a senior colleague gave him the essential survival advice of the place. There are secrets everywhere, he was told, and the less you know that does not concern you, the safer you will be. Remember that name, Sakharov, because his story will carry us to the moral heart of all this before we are done. This was the atmosphere in which the first Soviet atomic bomb took shape, and here the romantic image of lone genius has to give way to a harder truth. The Soviets did not invent their first bomb from nothing, they copied it. The device they built, codenamed RDS-1, was to a remarkable degree a duplicate of the American plutonium bomb that had destroyed Nagasaki, the weapon known as Fat Man. This was a deliberate choice, and it was Beria's choice above all. Beria did not trust his scientists to gamble on an untested original design, when the stakes were the survival of the state and, quite literally, their own lives. He held in his hands something extraordinary, a detailed picture of a bomb that was already known to work. The device itself was a marvel of grim precision. At its heart sat a sphere of plutonium, only a few kilograms of metal, cast in two hollow hemispheres and wrapped in a heavy shell of uranium that would reflect neutrons back inward and hold the reaction together for a few extra fractions of a second. At the very center waited a tiny capsule of polonium and beryllium designed to flood the core with neutrons at the instant of maximum compression and light the fuse. Around all of it lay an intricate shell of shaped high explosives, dozens of precisely machined blocks that had to fire in perfect unison. Get the timing wrong by a sliver, and the whole thing would fizzle into a radioactive mess. Get it right, and a lump of metal you could hold in two hands would release the energy of tens of thousands of tons of conventional explosive. That picture came from espionage, and the espionage was astonishing in its reach. The single most valuable source was a German-born physicist named Klaus Fuchs, a committed communist who had fled the Nazis, joined a British atomic effort, and then worked at Los Alamos itself, at the very heart of the American project. Fuchs passed the Soviets precise technical details, the design of the implosion system that crushed the plutonium core to critical mass, the arrangement of the explosive lenses, the workings of the initiator that triggered the chain reaction. He did this, not for money, but out of conviction. His total payment across years of spying amounted to only a few $100s. Fuchs was not alone. A young American physicist at Los Alamos, Theodore Hall, independently decided to pass secrets to the Soviets, and he was never prosecuted for it. A machinist named David Greenglass, working at the same laboratory, fed information out through a network connected to Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. A courier named Harry Gold moved between sources and Soviet handlers carrying the material along. Together, these people handed Moscow a shortcut of incalculable value. As early as 1943, when Kurchatov first reviewed a sheaf of intelligence from the West, he wrote that the material was of enormous, inestimable importance. He was reading, in effect, the accumulated results of the most expensive scientific project in American history, delivered for free. How much did the spying actually matter? Historians have argued this for decades. The honest answer is careful rather than dramatic. The best judgment of scholars who have studied the archives is that espionage saved the Soviet Union somewhere in the range of 1 to 2 years. Fuchs himself believed he had advanced the program by about a year. That is enormous, but it is not everything. The Soviet Union had a deep and genuine tradition of world-class physics. Its scientists understood the problem and could have solved it on their own, only more slowly and at greater expense. Kurchatov, tellingly, could not simply hand the stolen designs to his team and declare the job done. He had to have every piece of intelligence independently verified by his own people, both to confirm it was correct and to disguise where it had come from, because only a tiny handful of men were permitted to know that spying was involved at all. The bomb, in other words, was stolen in its blueprint and earned in its execution. What no shortcut could buy was time, and time was the one thing Stalin demanded above all. From the secret decree that created the Design Bureau to the flash over the Kazakh steppe, barely 3 years passed. That pace was punishing. Scientists worked around the clock under the constant watch of Beria's security men, knowing that failure could mean not just disgrace, but prison or worse. Every calculation had to be checked and rechecked, every intelligence report independently confirmed, every component machined to tolerances the battered post-war Soviet industry could barely achieve. That the effort succeeded at all and so quickly is a testament both to the brilliance of the people involved and to the sheer crushing force of a state that would accept no excuses and permit no delay. The pipeline eventually broke. Codebreakers in the West, working through intercepted Soviet communications in a long-running secret effort, began to unravel the network. Fuchs was identified and questioned, and in January of 1950, he confessed. He was sentenced to 14 years in prison, served about 9, and on his release emigrated to Communist East Germany. Others in the network paid a far higher price. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, accused of helping to relay atomic secrets to the Soviets, were convicted and, in 1953, put to death in the electric chair, the only American civilians ever executed for espionage during the Cold War. But by the time these networks were rolled up, the damage, from the Western point of view, was long done. The Soviet Union had already tested its bomb. The plutonium at the heart of that first bomb did not come from Arzamas 16. It came from another secret city, hundreds of kilometers to the east, hidden in the southern Urals. This was the place that would carry, perhaps, the heaviest human cost of the entire program. And its story runs alongside Sarov like a dark twin. Near the town of Kishdim, the state built a vast plutonium production complex known as the Mayak Combine, and around it, a closed city first called Chelyabinsk 40. There, in giant reactors, uranium was transformed into the plutonium that weapons required. The first of those reactors, a machine the workers nicknamed Anyushka, reached criticality in the summer of 1948, and it was Kurchatov himself who helped bring it to life. Over the decades that followed, Mayak would produce roughly 31 tons of weapons-grade plutonium, a large share of the entire Soviet stockpile of about 145 tons. The work inside those reactors carried its own quiet danger. In the rush to produce plutonium, safety often came second to output. When something went wrong deep inside a reactor, when fuel channels jammed or failed, workers were sometimes sent in to clear the problem by hand, absorbing doses of radiation that no one fully accounted for at the time. In the first decade of the plant's operation, thousands of its workers were exposed to dangerous levels of radiation. They were the unseen labor behind the arsenal, the men and women who handled the most dangerous material on Earth, so that the designers in the forest would have something to shape into a weapon. Building these places demanded staggering amounts of labor, and much of that labor was not free. The Soviet atomic project leaned heavily on the vast prison system of the Gulag and on conscripted workers. Tens of thousands of prisoners and prisoners of war dug the foundations, poured the concrete, and raised the buildings of the secret cities. At the time, forced labor made up close to a quarter of the entire non-agricultural workforce of the Soviet economy. Estimates of the total number of people involved in the atomic project across all its sites run into the hundreds of thousands, and by some accounts approach 750,000 by the end of the 1940s, more than half of them forced laborers. Many prisoners who built the most sensitive sites were never released even after their sentences ended. Precisely so, they could never describe what they had seen. On the 29th of August, 1949, everything came together at a test range in the steppe of Kazakhstan, near a place called Semipalatinsk. Just before dawn, at 7 in the morning, the first Soviet atomic bomb was detonated atop a steel tower some 30 meters tall. Around it, the scientists had built a small artificial world to measure the weapon's power. There were houses and a bridge. There was a section of mock railway and a fragment of a subway. There were vehicles and military equipment, and there were roughly 1,500 animals, tethered at varying distances to gauge the effects of blast and heat and radiation on living tissue. The bomb yielded around 22 kilotons, close to the American weapon it copied. In the hours after the blast, teams moved out across the experimental field to read the results. They found the mock houses flattened, the bridge twisted, the tethered animals killed or burned at distances that told the scientists exactly how far the weapon's lethal reach extended. Every crushed wall and scorched surface was a data point. This was the cold arithmetic of the whole enterprise. Destruction measured, catalogued, and fed back into the next design so that the following bomb would be more efficient, more powerful, or easier to carry than the last. Beria was present, and the terror of the moment reveals everything about the system that produced it. He had reportedly prepared two fates for the men around him. If the bomb worked, they would be showered with honors, medals, houses, cars, and cash. If it failed, many of them would be shot or sent to the camps. The bomb worked. Kurchatov and Khariton received the highest civilian honor the state could bestow. The scientists lived, the gamble had paid off, and the American monopoly on the atomic bomb was over. Far away, a United States reconnaissance aircraft, flying between Japan and Alaska, picked up traces of radioactive fallout in the atmosphere a few days later, and the West learned that the Soviets had joined the nuclear age far sooner than anyone had predicted. In Washington, the news landed hard. American planners had assumed the Soviet Union was years away, perhaps unable to build a bomb before the middle of the 1950s. Instead, on September 23, 1949, President Harry Truman announced to the world that an atomic explosion had taken place inside the Soviet Union. The comfortable monopoly the United States had enjoyed for 4 short years was over, and the real arms race, the one that would shape the rest of the century, had begun. The test site itself became another zone of secrecy and quiet damage. Over the following 4 decades, hundreds of nuclear devices would be detonated at Semipalatinsk, many of them in the open air in the early years. The villages scattered across the surrounding steppe were often neither warned before a test nor evacuated after one. Generations of people downwind lived with the fallout, their exposure studied but rarely explained to them. The bomb that ended the American monopoly was, for the people nearest to where it was born, the beginning of a long and hidden harm. But the successful test only deepened the need for secrecy, and it expanded the hidden world of the closed cities into a full archipelago. Arzamas 16 and Chelyabinsk 40 were only the beginning. In the years that followed, the Soviet Union built a whole constellation of these places, an entire hidden network devoted to the atomic project and to secret military work of every kind. The leadership even created a second, separate weapons design center farther east so that the nation's ability to build its arsenal would never again depend on a single vulnerable town. The whole network came to be governed as a special category of settlement, administered under the tight grip of the security apparatus and formalized under a bureaucratic label that translates as closed administrative territorial formations. In plain terms, they were closed cities. By the later years of Russian history, more than 40 of them would be publicly acknowledged, holding a combined population of well over 1 million people, with more believed to exist whose names and locations were never disclosed at all. These cities were not scattered at random. Together, they formed a single integrated system, a supply chain built for the arsenal. In some, raw uranium ore was processed and enriched. In others, reactors bred plutonium from that uranium. In the design centers like Sarov, the material was shaped into working weapons. In still others, those weapons were assembled in series and stockpiled, and, out on the remote proving grounds, the finished designs were detonated and studied. Each secret city was a single link in a chain that ran from the mines of Central Asia to the frozen ranges of the Arctic. Every link sealed off, every link guarded. The whole enormous machine kept invisible even to the citizens whose country it was built to defend. To understand what daily life was actually like inside one of these places, you have to abandon almost everything you assume about the Soviet Union. The stereotype of the Soviet experience is scarcity, empty shelves, long queues, and grinding shortage. Inside the closed cities, the opposite was often true. These were, in a strange way, gilded cages. The state understood that it was asking its most valuable people to give up their freedom to accept surveillance, isolation, and silence, and so it paid them handsomely in the currency that mattered most in a country of shortages: comfort. Residents of the closed cities enjoyed a standard of living most Soviet citizens could only dream of. The stores were stocked with goods that were simply unavailable elsewhere. There were fresh fruits, delicacies, imported items, good quality meat and dairy. Housing was better and more plentiful, wages were higher, schools were superior, and hospitals better equipped. Crime was low because the entire population was screened and monitored. One senior physicist who lived this life later described the closed sites as a white archipelago, a deliberate contrast with the black archipelago of the prison camps, and he recalled that his family experienced no real hardship at all. The people inside were told again and again that they were something special, that they were the nuclear shield of the motherland, the guardians who kept the nation safe from destruction. Many of them believed it, and many of them were proud. The price of that comfort was a kind of erasure that is hard to fully imagine. To enter or leave a closed city required a special pass and a security clearance, checked at guarded gates set into the perimeter. That perimeter was ringed with fences, walls, and watchposts, and it was patrolled. Your identity documents did not name the place where you actually lived. Instead, they recorded a nearby regional center, so that even your own papers lied about where you were. Your mail was routed through a false address in a distant, ordinary city, with a special postal code that funneled it invisibly to the closed town. You did not appear in the ordinary population records of the country at all. And for long stretches, especially in the early years, contact with the outside world was severely restricted or forbidden entirely. In the plutonium city in the Urals, for the first years of its existence, residents were not permitted to leave, not permitted to write freely to relatives, not permitted to tell their own families where they were or what they did. To parents and siblings on the outside, these people had simply vanished. Some families concluded that their sons and daughters must be dead, gone without explanation into the machinery of the state. At Arzamas 16, specialists could have their passports taken and held. Permissions to leave the city was granted only in the rarest circumstances: the death of a close relative, a medical emergency requiring treatment unavailable inside, a genuine disaster. Even decades later, long after the harshest restrictions eased, the culture of silence endured. Workers at the nuclear center could not tell their families what they did. They could not carry recording devices to work. Foreign travel was closed to them. When relatives from outside wished to visit, applications had to be filed with the security services months in advance. An entire population lived its whole life inside a secret, understanding that the secret was the condition of everything they had. There is a haunting detail from one of these cities that captures the bubble in which these children of the atom grew up. A resident who had spent an entire childhood inside the wire in a clean-ordered, well-supplied town where poverty had been engineered out of existence recalled the shock of leaving for the first time and seeing a beggar. It was, she said, genuinely bewildering, a sight she had reached adolescence without ever encountering. The closed city was so complete, so self-contained, that it produced people who did not quite know what the rest of their own country looked like. For all the confinement, many of the scientists remembered these years as the most intense and rewarding of their lives. Behind the wire, insulated from the shortages and the political churn of the wider country, they were handed a rare gift: the resources to chase the hardest problems in physics with almost no limit on funding, alongside some of the finest minds in the nation. Within the walls of the installation, in the seminar rooms and the laboratories, there existed a strange and genuine freedom of thought, even as freedom of movement was taken away. It was one more contradiction in a place assembled almost entirely out of them. Now we come to the machinery that made the weapons possible, the deep, meticulous, and often invisible work that the whole system existed to perform. Designing a nuclear weapon is not a single flash of insight. It is an endless grind of calculation, testing, and refinement. In the early years, the scientists of Azama 16 did much of it by hand and by mind, without the computing power we now take for granted. Teams of mathematicians performed the enormous calculations required to model how an implosion would compress a core, how a chain reaction would spread, how energy would move through a device in the fractions of a second between detonation and destruction. They were, in a real sense, human computers, working through equations that later machines would need to solve. The physics itself was unforgiving. To make plutonium explode, you cannot simply bring a large mass together, because it will begin to react and blow itself apart before the reaction can build. Instead, you must take a smaller, stable amount and crush it symmetrically and instantly into a much denser state, so that it crosses into the runaway chain reaction and releases its energy all at once. Achieving that perfect, spherical, simultaneous crush requires a shell of carefully shaped high explosives detonated at many points at exactly the same instant, focusing the force inward with geometric precision. A tiny error in timing or shape, and the implosion becomes lopsided, the core squirts out instead of compressing, and the weapon fails. This was the problem the designers wrestled with, and it is why so much of their work involved no nuclear material at all, but the patient testing of conventional explosive assemblies in the surrounding forest. That demand for testing is part of why the location mattered so much. Day and night, the sound of high explosive detonations rolled through the woods around Sarov as the designers refined the shape and timing of their implosion systems. The remoteness that had once drawn hermits seeking silence now served a very different purpose. It swallowed the noise of a weapons program. The monastery bells had been replaced, not by prayer, but by the flat concussion of test charges echoing off the trees. And when a design was finally ready, the true test came at the distant range in Kazakhstan, where the open steppe absorbed blast after blast across the years, far from any eyes that were not meant to see. But the work at Azama 16 did not stop at the atomic bomb. The scientists were pushed almost immediately toward a far more terrible goal, the hydrogen bomb, a weapon powered not by splitting atoms, but by fusing them, capable of yields measured not in the tens of kilotons, but in the millions of tons of equivalent explosive force. And here the young man we met earlier stepped into the center of the story, Andrei Sakharov, whose life would trace the full moral arc of the nuclear age. Sakharov had come up under one of the great figures of Soviet physics, working in a special theoretical group in Moscow before moving out to the installation at the start of the 1950s. He was a theoretical physicist of dazzling ability, and he threw himself into the problem of the hydrogen bomb. He conceived of a design built from alternating layers of nuclear fuel, a structure his colleagues nicknamed the layer cake. On the 12th of August 1953, this design was tested, and unlike the enormous building-sized American thermonuclear device that had preceded it, the Soviet weapon was compact enough to actually be delivered as a bomb. Sakharov became a hero of the state almost overnight. In the same year, still only in his early 30s, he was elected to the highest ranks of Soviet science, one of the youngest ever to receive the honor. The Americans had detonated a thermonuclear device of their own the year before, but it was a cumbersome experimental apparatus, chilled with liquid fuel and housed in a structure the size of a small building, useless as a weapon of war. The Soviet layer cake, by contrast, could in principle be loaded onto an aircraft and dropped. For a brief moment, in this one narrow sense, the student had drawn level with the teacher. The layer cake had limits, though. It could not be scaled up without end. The true breakthrough came a couple of years later, when Sakharov and his colleagues arrived at what they called the third idea, the principle of using the radiation from a fission trigger to compress and ignite a separate fusion stage. It was, in essence, the same deep insight that American designers had reached by a different path. On the 22nd of November 1955, the Soviets tested a true, staged hydrogen bomb built on this principle, deliberately holding it to about half its potential power for the sake of safety. It still released more than 1.5 megatons. The door to weapons of essentially unlimited destructive force now stood open, and for his work Sakharov would in time be named a hero of socialist labor, 3 separate times. The peak of that terrible road came on the 30th of October 1961, high in the Arctic over the islands of Novaya Zemlya. There, the Soviet Union detonated the largest explosion ever created by human beings, a hydrogen bomb designed by a team at Azama 16 that included Sakharov and ordered by the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev to coincide with a great Communist Party Congress as a demonstration of raw power. History knows it as the Tsar Bomba. It was originally conceived to yield around 100 megatons, but the designers deliberately cut its power roughly in half to reduce the fallout, replacing part of its structure so that it would produce a still almost unimaginable 50 megatons. Even at half strength, it was more powerful than every explosive used in the whole of the Second World War combined many times over. It was carried by a specially modified heavy bomber and lowered on a great parachute to give the aircraft time to escape, and even so, the crew were given only a slim chance of surviving the blast. The fireball spread miles across. The mushroom cloud climbed to the very edge of the atmosphere, dozens of kilometers high. The flash was visible from 1,000 kilometers away, and the shockwaves circled the entire planet more than once. Windows were reported broken hundreds of kilometers distant. It was, in a sense, the ultimate product of the secret city in the forest, proof that human beings could now build weapons with no practical upper limit at all. For Sakharov, the Tsar Bomba was not a triumph but a turning point. The man who had helped give his country the hydrogen bomb grew increasingly horrified by what he had made and by the endless cycle of testing that spread radioactive fallout across the world. He began to speak out, first quietly, then openly. He lobbied against atmospheric testing. He had come to believe, from his own calculations, that the fallout drifting down from years of open-air tests would silently cause the deaths of many thousands of people around the world, and the thought gave him no peace. In 1968, he wrote a long essay calling for intellectual freedom, for an end to the arms race, and for peaceful coexistence between the nuclear powers. It circulated around the world and cost him his place in secret work forever. In doing so, he transformed himself from the state's most celebrated weaponeer into its most famous dissident. In 1975, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, though he was not permitted to travel to accept it, and his wife, Yelena Bonner, received it on his behalf. And after he protested the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan at the end of the 1970s, he was stripped of his honors and banished. From 1980 to 1986, he lived in internal exile in a closed city on the Volga, held under constant surveillance, cut off from the world. The same system of secret cities that had once been his laboratory became, in the end, his prison. While the designers at Azama 16 refined ever more powerful weapons, the production city in the Urals was quietly poisoning its own region, and this is where the human cost of the secret archipelago becomes impossible to look away from. The Mayak plutonium complex was built in desperate haste under a leadership that valued output above all else and had little regard for the safety of workers or the surrounding population. Making plutonium generates enormous quantities of intensely radioactive waste, and in the early years, the Combine simply had nowhere safe to put it, so it put the waste into the environment. For several years, beginning in 1949, the plant discharged high-level radioactive waste directly into the Tejo River, the same river from which tens of thousands of villagers downstream drew their drinking water, washed their clothes, and watered their animals. In the first years of dumping alone, the Combine released several million curies of radioactivity into the water, and across the whole period, it poured tens of millions of cubic meters of contaminated waste into the river system. Some 124,000 people lived in the villages strung along that river. They were not told. For many of them, the Tejo was the only water source they had. The village of Metlino, only about 7 kilometers downstream from the plant, absorbed some of the heaviest doses of all. Soviet doctors, confronting a wave of illness they could not publicly explain, quietly created a new medical category to describe what they were seeing, a chronic form of radiation sickness. Eventually, the authorities resettled many of the contaminated villages and tried to fence people away from the river. But by then, years of exposure had already done their work. When the river could no longer absorb the waste, the plant turned to a small lake nearby and made it into one of the most radioactive places on the surface of the Earth. Year after year, the combine poured its liquid waste into that lake until it held an accumulated burden, estimated at more than 100 million curies of long-lived radiation, a concentration so extreme that standing at the shore for a short time could deliver a lethal dose. Then, in 1967, a drought lowered the water and exposed the poisoned lakebed. Wind lifted the radioactive dust and scattered it across the surrounding country, dosing hundreds of thousands more people. The lake was such an intractable danger that the authorities spent decades filling it in with concrete blocks, rock, and soil, a burial that was not essentially complete until well into the present century. And then, on the 29th of September 1957, came the disaster that would eventually give the Soviet secret cities their most infamous chapter. At the Mayak complex, a large underground tank held tens of tons of concentrated liquid radioactive waste, and its cooling system had failed and gone unrepaired. Without cooling, the waste heated, dried, and became chemically unstable. In the late afternoon, that tank exploded with tremendous force, hurling aside a concrete lid weighing well over 100 tons and throwing a vast cloud of radioactive material into the sky. It released something on the order of 20 million curies of radioactivity. A portion of that, carried on the wind, drifted into a long plume that reached 300 to 350 kilometers across the countryside, contaminating a swath of land over which several 100,000 people lived. This became known as the East Ural radioactive trace. Because the city where it happened did not officially exist, the catastrophe could not be named for its true location. It was instead named for the nearest town that appeared on ordinary maps, and so the world would eventually come to call it the Kishtim disaster. In the scale of nuclear accidents, it ranks among the very worst in history, exceeded in radioactivity released only by Chernobyl and, decades later, Fukushima. More than 20 villages, holding something like 10 to 12,000 people, were evacuated, some within days, some only after many months of continued exposure. Crops were buried, livestock was slaughtered. Whole communities were wiped from the map, their houses demolished, their land abandoned. And, through it all, the Soviet state said nothing. The silence around Kishtim lasted for decades, and the way it finally broke is a remarkable story in itself. The first serious public account in the West did not come until 1976, when an exiled Soviet scientist, the biologist George Medvedev, described the disaster in a British science magazine. He called it one of the greatest peacetime nuclear tragedies the world had known. At first, astonishingly, he was not believed. The head of the British Atomic Energy Authority publicly dismissed his account as rubbish, as a figment of the imagination. It seemed too large, too terrible, too well hidden to be real. Medvedev expanded his findings into a full book, and gradually the evidence became undeniable. What makes the episode even more striking is that Western intelligence had actually learned of the disaster years earlier, not long after it happened, through informants and aerial surveillance, and had chosen to stay quiet. The reasons were partly self-interested. To publicize a catastrophic nuclear waste accident anywhere in the world risked frightening the public about the safety of nuclear facilities at home. And so, for its own reasons, the West kept the Soviet secret nearly as well as the Soviets did. The Soviet government itself did not officially acknowledge the disaster until 1989, more than 30 years after it occurred. The true toll of the Mayak complex across the river, dumping the poisoned lake, and the great explosion may never be known with precision, and honesty requires saying so plainly. Radiation-induced cancers cannot be told apart, case by case, from cancers that arise by chance, and Soviet doctors worked under intense pressure to limit official diagnoses. Within the first decade of the plant's operation, Records indicate that more than 17,000 of its own workers received dangerous radiation overexposures. Estimates of the number of people significantly affected by the wider contamination range from a couple of 100,000 to more than 500,000, and at least 200 deaths are directly attributed to the disaster, with an unknown and larger toll hidden in the cancers of later years. What is not in dispute is that the Combine, over its decades of operation, released a quantity of radioactivity into its region comparable in scale to Chernobyl itself, and that thousands of workers and villagers paid for the bomb with their health and their lives, most of them never knowing exactly what had been done to them or why. That was the true bargain hidden inside the secret cities. Extraordinary competence and extraordinary harm, grown from the same soil. The secrecy that shielded the weapons from foreign eyes also shielded the men who ran the program from any reckoning with the people they had injured. For most of the Cold War, that wall of silence held, the cities stayed off the maps. The people stayed erased, the disasters stayed buried. But secrecy of this kind depends on the survival of the system that maintains it. And by the late 1980s, that system was beginning to fail. The Soviet Union was straining under economic stagnation, a costly and losing war in Afghanistan, and the slow loosening of controls under a new leadership. As the old certainties cracked, the hidden world of the closed cities began, at last, to become visible. The revelations came in a rush as the Soviet state collapsed at the start of the 1990s. The existence of the closed cities was acknowledged. Their true names were restored. The plutonium city in the Urals shed its numbered code name and, in 1994, became the town of Ozersk. And in a moment of deep historical resonance, Azama 16, after a brief interval under yet another cover name, once again became Sarov. In 1995, reclaiming the name it had carried as a place of pilgrimage centuries before the bomb. The town that had been the holy ground of a saint, then a factory of shell casings, then the secret birthplace of Soviet nuclear weapons, could finally be spoken of aloud. And yet, when the wire could finally have come down, the people inside often chose to keep it up. This is one of the most revealing facts about the whole strange world of the closed cities. When residents of the plutonium city were given the chance, in the uncertain years after the collapse, to open their home to the outside world, they voted instead to remain closed, to keep their fences and their guards and their special status. After a lifetime inside the bubble, the security, the order, and the privileges felt safer than the chaos of the new Russia beyond the gates. The people downstream had no such choice. Long after the Soviet Union was gone, the villages along the poisoned river and inside the fallout zone were still living with the consequences, still burying people young, still fighting for recognition and for the modest compensation the new Russian state was willing to offer. Many had spent their whole lives beside a river they were never warned about, in the shadow of a plant they were never told existed. For them, the end of the secrecy did not undo the harm. It only, at long last, gave it a name. What became of these people and their knowledge posed a genuine danger to the whole world in the 1990s. Here were cities full of brilliant weapons, scientists suddenly impoverished, their salaries collapsing along with the state that had employed them, their expertise prized by any nation or group hoping to build a bomb of its own. The fear that this knowledge might leak outward, that a desperate physicist might sell what he knew to the highest bidder, drove an unusual chapter of cooperation between old enemies. American programs were created specifically to fund former Soviet weapons scientists to work on peaceful projects, to keep them employed and their knowledge contained. Money flowed through new joint ventures and international science centers set up for exactly this purpose. In one of the more remarkable gestures of the era, the American laboratory at Los Alamos and the Russian center at Sarov, the original and its dark mirror established direct ties, the very rivals who had once raced each other in total secrecy, now working together to prevent the spread of what they had both created. Sarov and Ozersk remain closed to this day. They did not fade away with the Cold War that created them. Sarov is still the home of Russia's principal nuclear weapons design center, still ringed by security, still tasked with maintaining the arsenal. The city around the Mayak plant still exists, still one of the most contaminated landscapes on the planet, still living with the consequences of decisions made in the frantic early years of the atomic race. The secret archipelago did not dissolve. it simply became a little less invisible. It is worth asking what all of this brought. The secrecy, the forced labor, the poisoned rivers, the erased families, the enormous expense. What did the closed cities actually achieve for the state that built them? In cold strategic terms, they worked. Within a few years of that first test, the Soviet Union possessed a growing arsenal of atomic and then thermonuclear weapons, enough to guarantee that no enemy could strike it without facing devastation in return. The balance of terror that defined the rest of the century, the grim stability in which two superpowers held each other in check because neither could survive a full war, rested in part on the weapons designed in that forest. In a bleak sense, the secret city helped keep the Cold War cold. Whether that outcome justified its cost is a question each person has to weigh for themselves. But the strategic logic, however terrible, is hard to wave away. So what are we finally to make of the secret city that built the bomb and never appeared on any map? The temptation is to reduce it to a single tidy lesson, but the place resists that, and it is more interesting for resisting it. Start with the strangeness of where it all happened. A weapon of ultimate destruction was designed on consecrated ground, in the forest where a hermit once sought God in silence. The men who built the bomb did not choose that ground for its meaning. They chose it because it was remote and already had a factory. The irony was an accident of geography, and yet it lingers, this collision of the sacred and the apocalyptic on a single patch of Russian forest, as if the century had folded its deepest contradictions into one place and left them there. Then there is what the closed cities reveal about people and the price of comfort. The Soviet state discovered that it could purchase silence, obedience, and even loyalty, not with terror alone but with abundance, and that once people had accepted the trade, many of them would defend it. They would guard the very walls that confined them. That is not a lesson about the Soviet Union alone. It is a lesson about what human beings will accept and even come to cherish when confinement arrives, wrapped in security and a full pantry. And there is the figure at the center of it all, the person asked to be a free mind and an obedient instrument at the same time. Andrei Sakharov was celebrated as a hero and then broken as a dissident, exiled by the very apparatus he had armed. His arc is the sharpest expression of the contradiction the whole enterprise was built upon. The state wanted minds keen enough to design a hydrogen bomb, but tame enough never to ask why they were building it. Given room to think, a mind of that caliber will eventually turn its attention on the system that houses it and begin to wonder whether the whole undertaking is just. In the long run, the state could not have it both ways. The scientists who were carried into that forest in the years after the war were being delivered into a place that had been deliberately unmade, scrubbed from the maps, deleted from the census, hidden behind a false address and a wall of shifting code names. For decades the strategy worked. An entire city, an entire way of life, an entire chapter of history unfolded in a blank space on the map, witnessed only by the people who were both trapped and privileged inside it. The weapons they built there shaped the balance of the world, held nations in a standoff of mutual fear, and hang over us still. But no secret is truly permanent, because paper survives, memory survives, and poisoned ground keeps its own record, long after the men who ordered it are gone. The maps have been redrawn, the names have been restored. The disasters have been admitted, if only long after the fact. The blank space in the forest has a name again, the old name, the one it carried before the bomb, before the factory, before the wire. Sarov, a place hidden so completely that for half a century it did not officially exist, and that endured anyway, because the truth, however deeply it is buried, has a way of waiting patiently for someone to come and dig it out.